I guess it all begins with the house. The house I grew up in was small and newly built. People seeing it for the first time would describe it as unique or even cute. It wasn't at all the foreboding haunted house that is so common in stories. It just had a couple of odd quirks. Like how the whole thing was shaped like a big Z and lifted 6 feet into the air on wooden stilts. Or how it had these giant shoji-style windows. Or how sometimes it screamed. It was aligned at northeast with large windows offset on the opposite ends of the house. My mother and father had designed and built it themselves in a small town on the big island of Hawaii. They wanted to build a house that could be easily cooled off by the trade winds, and they had been horribly successful. On the days when wind came barreling down the mountain like a freight train, the giant windows would funnel the air through our house like a pipe organ, and structure would let out a low wail, and some people swore they could hear it a kilometer away. We didn't have many neighbors, living in a pasture land on the edge of the town, with a populace of about 400, but our house had an island-wide reputation. It was called the Singing House, which was a testament to people's positivity. It was a big deal when people found out I lived in the Singing House. One of my best friends growing up had a strict religious family. Once, when we were both under 10, I had ended up sleeping over at his house on a Saturday night, and in the rush of the next morning, they had brought me with them to Mass. I was excited to go. Their church was this huge wooden building with a high-peaked roof and a bell tower. I had never been able to see the inside, and I had always wanted to. When we got there, everyone was singing, and it felt like I had accidentally been allowed into a secret club. We walked quietly to an empty pew, and I stumbled through some prayers and songs. And then all the kids got to go sit on a carpet and watch VeggieTales. And then they were ushered into another room where heaping plates of sausages and waffles and even donuts were arranged on a buffet bar. At the moment, I was 100% on board with church. My friends, Kama's parents, even told me that if I wanted, I could keep going with them. It was great. We all sat down with our food, and Kama and I started talking about the sort of junk kids talk about. And then a woman I had never met joined our table. She looked at me for a second before turning to Kama's parents and asking, "Who's this?" Kama's mom introduced me as KJ, our neighbor, and Kama's friend. The lady hummed, staring at me over her plate of waffles. She didn't seem friendly. Conversation resumed. I began an exaggerated story about the size of a wasp nest that I had sprayed the night before. No joke, the size of a basketball, I told Kama. "Psh, no way," he told me. "I'll show you," I claimed. The wasp nest wasn't actually the size of a basketball, so I don't know what possessed me to say this, but it convinced Kama for the time being. "I bet the sound your house makes attracts them," Kama said. "Yeah," I agreed. "They probably think it's a giant hive." Misguidingly sensing an opportunity ingratiate me to the waffle woman, who was still staring, Kama turned to her and announced, "KJ lives in the Singing House." Living in the Singing House made me a minor celebrity on this side of the Big Island. My house had been featured in tour books, and to be fair, around here it didn't take much to turn vague recognition into interest. So, usually mentioning the house was a good conversation starter. This time, however, it was not. The lady reacted to Kama's information like he had informed her that I had killed puppies for fun. Her face drained of color and her chair grinding back loudly as she stood. I remember being afraid that I had done something to her, that at some point I had wronged this strange woman and that she had only then recognized me. "I can smell them on you," she said, her voice low and shaking. She jabbed at me with a gnarled finger. "You are not welcome here. You invite the devils. I smell them," she yelled. Her face was flush and twisted. The sudden commotion brought the room to a confused silence. People stopped mid-chew to look at us. Someone coughed. "Auntie, why don't you step outside?" a young woman tried. The yelling had stunned me and it made my eyes water. I knew I needed to do something to retain my pride. "You don't smell great either," I yelled. Kama's parents swiftly removed us from the church and the drive home was tense. I was not invited back. Back then, life in my town was simple. Mostly people worked in the land, keeping cows or growing things to sell to hotels and restaurants. Kids played outside and had fun doing traditional things, like fishing, camping, or hard drugs. Life was small. I left as soon as I possibly could. I wanted to go to the university in California, and I didn't even care what I learned there. Like an idiot, I dove headfirst into student debt just so I had an excuse to leave home. I was being selfish. My father had left when I was small. Technically, he was a missing person, but we were pretty sure he had just pissed off. And my only brother had died of an overdose when he was 16. It was just me and my mom, who had only recently retired from teaching. And then I went to California, and it was only her left alone in that empty house. It was something I tried not to think about. There wasn't anything I could do. I couldn't visit her. Anytime I wasn't in school, I spent working as many hours as I could get. I couldn't afford a ticket to Hawaii every summer. At first, I tried to call her once a week, but it didn't last. There was never much to say. I didn't want to tell her how badly my life was going, and she very rarely left the house. At first, I would just listen as she told me about the animals. She told me about how wild pigs had been tearing up our pasture, and how her eyesight wasn't good enough to shoot them. About how the sheep and chickens kept disappearing. And then she stopped talking about them. Instead, she started telling me about the owls. My mom always had a thing for owls, but now it seemed to be developing into a kind of obsession. She had called me in the middle of the night just to tell me that she had seen one. They were giant, she said. They watched over her. She sent me pictures, but they were always blurry and out of focus. Her eyes had gone bad. A couple years after I left, she got a dog, a little hair terrier, and blurry pictures of it replaced the ones of owls. Now our conversations were mostly just her recounting everything her dog did that day. How many times she brushed it, or how smart something it did was, or how much it liked sitting with her. When I finally graduated, she was so happy. "I can't wait to see you, sweetheart," she told me. "It's been quiet." I took a job in the city the next day. When I told her, she cried. She said she understood that I was building my future and that it was okay. That she was just an emotional old lady. I tried to believe her. I asked her how the dog was doing, hoping to get her to stop crying into the phone. She told me the dog had disappeared, that she had let it out one night and it hadn't come back. She looked for it for days, tripping through the fields and calling its name. But then she found some hair and blood and decided she didn't want to look anymore. I told her how sorry I was and offered to buy her a new dog, but she just kept crying. We talked even less after that. She started to send me pictures of blurry white blobs again, saying they were owls. And then I lost my job. 5 years of my life I spent working there, and they let me go like it was nothing. Budget cuts. Without that job, I couldn't make rent anymore, not where I lived, and no other offer would call me back. I had nowhere to go, so I finally went home. I didn't warn my mom that I was coming. I told myself that it would be a surprise, but honestly, I think I just didn't want to tell her that I had failed. I was 27 and moving back home. When the plane touched down and I felt the tropical humidity for the first time in 9 years, it was almost nice. It was dark by the time I turned onto the dirt road that would take me home. When I got to the old gate at the end of our driveway, I found the chain that held it in place was broken, leaving it swinging in the wind. As a child, I constantly got in trouble for leaving the gate open, even for just a minute. Every morning, it was a challenge for us to get out and keep the sheep in. But now the animals were gone and the gate no longer had a purpose. I got out of the car to push it open, propping it on a rock. I looked down the dark driveway. It had always been unpaved, but in my absence, it had grown wild, with banana trees and cane grass crowding it in a way they had never had before. A strong gust of wind swept by, stirring up a symphony of rustling plants, chirping insects, and the deep, echoing wail of the house. It might have been horrifying if it wasn't so nostalgic. The rest of the way up the driveway was hard on the suspension of my rental, but it managed. Yellow light began to filter through the branches and twigs that were snapping against the windshield, and the house came into view. I had imagined it looking no different than the last time that I saw it, with a delicate garden and bright paint, with old boots drying on the front porch, and chickens roosting in the trusses of the stills. Instead, I saw that the paint was flaking off in strips the size of dollar bills, and the front porch had begun to sag in a way that looked vaguely dangerous. Wild guava trees had twisted right up to the wide windows, and the grass was waist-high and thick. It twisted around the wheels of my mother's car, telling me that she hadn't left in a very long time. There was no garden anymore. If it wasn't for the dull light spilling from the windows, it would have looked abandoned. The porch light came on. The door swung open and there was my mother, hobbling out and squinting at me. "Are you Amazon?" she called. Her voice felt like a warm hug. "Mom?" I called back. She paused, her whole body drawing straight. I approached her. "I'm home," I said hesitantly. And then she was sobbing and we were hugging. She just about collapsed on the porch stairs and had to lean against me as we went inside. We sat together on the couch and I held her while she cried. Neither of us were feeling up to speaking. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. The next time I opened my eyes, I was 7 years old again, listening to my mother's soft breathing after she had fallen asleep telling me a story. It took me a couple of seconds to orient myself chronologically. Something was scraping against the window, 3 times, and then a short pause and then again. Branches, I thought. My mom was leaning against my shoulder and I couldn't get up without waking her. I tried to fall back asleep. It kept going, snapping me awake any time I began to relax. 3 scratches, and then silence. My mom began to snore and I looked at her. She was frighteningly unfamiliar as she slept. Her skin was paler, maybe thinner looking than I remembered, and marred with deep creases and wrinkles. I didn't remember her looking so old. I didn't remember her being especially young. The scraping came again, 3 times, a perfectly repeated pattern. There was no way that this was the wind. It had to be something else. I carefully got up, moving my mom's head so it slumped against her chest. I walked through the house, standing in the center and waiting for it to come again. It didn't for a long time, and then I heard a scrape from the window directly behind me, cutting off just as I turned. The light was on in the kitchen and it was casting a reflection against the glass, but behind it I saw the shape of something. It wasn't moving, not really, but somehow I knew it was alive. Carefully, I walked to the light switch, my eyes never leaving the animal. I flipped it off, getting rid of the glare. 2 wide eyes stared back at me, unhuman, but like no animal I could imagine. It leaned forward, raising an appendage as wiry as a branch. My mother screamed. I tore my eyes from the creature as she appeared in the doorway. The light came on, and when I looked back, there was nothing. My mother looked at me, tears in her eyes. "I thought you left," she said. I heard another scrape and my eyes snapped again to the window, where the limb of a guava tree was resting against the screen. The wind blew and it scraped again. There was no monster, I thought, just my own anxious mind. "I was just turning off the light," I said. She smiled at me. "You were always so responsible," she said. "Come, I have a bed made." She led me into my old room. It looked cleaner and emptier, but otherwise largely untouched, as if I had gone away to summer camp for a month. As if 10 years had not passed since I last stepped foot inside. She folded back the blankets for me like I was a child, and I noticed that there was no dust in the room. That night, I dreamed a crowd of people were gathered around the house, hiding in the overgrowth and standing perfectly still. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak to them, but I knew they were waiting for something. Life continued, interrupted only briefly by strange flashes in the corner of my eye, or horrible dreams that left me gasping for air. I got a job working for our neighbor. That the income was modest would be an understatement, but it was something, and I began to fix up the house. It was the middle of the day, and I just finished swapping out one of these stilts for the porch when it happened. It was like the ground beneath me evaporated, and I plunged into a freezing dark hole. And then I was standing in the trees and brush of the mountain forest. There was a loud sound and a warm feeling in my stomach, and when I looked down, all I saw was blood. Someone was crying, and I was being sucked away. This wasn't right. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I suddenly felt vulnerable, lost, hunted. And then I was back in the yard of my house, standing as if that's where I had always been. I was afraid that I was really going mad if my nightmares had reached me in the day. It wasn't much later that I saw the ghost, a short man in dirty clothes. When I saw him, my first instinct was to call out and ask what the heck he was doing in my yard. But then I noticed the way the grass was moving in the wind, passing through his body like it was nothing. His eyes met mine and his face twisted in fear. He ran underneath the house, as if to hide. Through my disbelief, I remember wondering why he was afraid of me. What could I possibly do to a ghost? From then on, I kept seeing him. He would appear and wander fearfully around the yard for a few minutes, before disappearing again. I know that I should have done something about it, but I honestly didn't know what that thing was. Call a priest? And what if they came and didn't see anything? I didn't want it spreading through the town that I was a lunatic. The worst part was when I tried to bring him up to my mother. He would be wandering around the yard and she would be sitting on the porch, and I would see her eyes tracking him. But when I asked her about it, she would act like she had no idea what I was talking about. I began to think that I truly lost my mind. That all changed when I was awoken in the middle of the night by a horrible noise, a loud and desperate rasping that echoed through the house. I was out of bed in an instant, creeping through the doorway and into the living room, where I saw my mother. She was unmoving, standing like a statue in the moonlight. She turned her head towards me, impossibly slow. "Come," she beckoned. "There's an owl in the yard." My legs were heavy with dread as I approached her, and followed the gaze of her vacant eyes out the window. At first, I saw nothing. "Be still," she cautioned. And then I saw the glimmer of a figure. The ghost. Everything about him looked desperate. He was crouched and shaking, his body heaving with invisible breaths. "That's the..." She cut me off. "Shh." and then I heard a sound. It was like the rumble of an earthquake and the hiss of a snake, primordial and terrorizing, petrifying to the point that even now, when I hear it in my dreams, I forget to breathe. It seemed to come from all over. The man had nowhere to run. The creature was on him before I even saw it. It moved with limbs like moray eels, nothing but muscle, grace, and sharp, unrelenting teeth. When its many mouths tore into him, he didn't bleed. Chunks of him were simply torn away like puzzle pieces. He struggled and fought, but the thing didn't even seem to notice. When the man had been entirely consumed, the creature remained in place, hunching over the space that had only moments ago been his meal. And then it turned almost hesitantly towards the window. Its face was as white as bone, small and disproportionate to the writhing mass of its body. The eyes that stared out of it were the ones I had seen on my first night here over a month ago. "Beautiful," my mother said, and all the way through the glass the creature seemed to hear her and preen. It let out a low, cooing sound, like the hoot of an owl, and then it was gone. I said nothing to my mother. What could I say after that? How much of that did her dull eyes actually take in? "The owls will always protect me," she said, and I was suddenly afraid of her. I knew she had seen the man, the ghost. I knew she had lied to me about it. I returned to my room and I packed my things. When this didn't surprise her, I knew I had made the right choice. I have a crappy job now, in a crappy apartment with a crappy roommate, but every so often my phone will chime, alerting me that my mother has sent me a photo. "Another owl," the message will say, but it isn't.